The rain wasn't falling, it was attacking. It came in horizontal sheets, a furious darkness trying to swallow the world whole. Inside the cockpit of her F-35C, Lieutenant Commander Eva Kozlov was a statue of focus. The storm screamed around her, a primal roar that vibrated through the very frame of the jet. Her eyes, reflected in the glowing green hue of the heads-up display, didn't blink. Lightning flashed, a sudden, terrifying strobe light that illuminated the churning black ocean miles below. For a split second, she was blind. Then, the instruments came back, her lifeline. Her hand, encased in a flight glove, rested steady on the control stick. A voice, tight with controlled stress, crackled in her helmet. It was the airborne warning and control plane, the eyes in the sky that were nearly as blind as she was in this weather. Eagle-7, be advised. Bogey is holding course, speed 500. You are 10 miles out. Eva's response was calm, a professional monotone that betrayed none of the adrenaline firing through her veins. Copy, Watchtower. 10 miles. Continuing intercept. She adjusted her throttle slightly, feeling the powerful engine respond. The noise was a constant, deafening hum, a sound she usually found comforting. Tonight, it was a grim reminder of her isolation. She was a single, fragile soul in a metal shell, suspended between an angry sea and an angry sky. They had called her Princess. They said she was too careful, too by the book, too privileged. The daughter of a famous general, they whispered, given a cockpit she didn't earn. The name was a joke, a constant, condescending punchline meant to keep her in her place. Another flash of lightning. This time, something else. A fleeting shadow against the gloom. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Instinct and years of relentless training took over. Her eyes snapped to the right, piercing the chaotic darkness. There, a sleek, unnatural shape, flying with a purpose no weather could dictate. An unmanned drone. Its design was foreign, menacing. It banked slightly, and a high-pitched, urgent whine screamed through her headset. A sound every pilot trains for and dreads. The tone of a radar lock. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't a drill anymore. This was real. The mockery of her call sign vanished from her mind, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. The lives of everyone on the USS Vigilance, the entire carrier strike group, were looking down the barrel of this thing. And she was the only one standing in its way. Her voice, when she spoke again to the tower, was still calm, but it now carried a new, iron weight. Tower, this is Eagle-7. I have visual. Confirm Bogey is a Category 5 drone. It's painting me. She took a breath, the oxygen from her mask feeling thin. Requesting instructions. Awaiting ROE clearance. Static was her only reply. The storm had severed the link. She was alone, completely alone. The drone began a slow, deliberate turn, not away from her, but toward the distant, vulnerable silhouette of her home, her ship. The decision was no longer the tower's. It was hers. Princess was gone. Only Eagle-7 remained. The screech of the radar lock was a needle in her ear, a constant, screaming reminder of the threat just outside her canopy. Every instinct told her to react, to brake, to jam the stick, and throw her jet into a defensive spiral. But she fought the urge. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her training took over, a cool, logical script running in her mind. She kept her hands steady, her breathing even. The drone held its position, a dark, silent predator mimicking her every move in the turbulent air. It was waiting for her to flinch. Her mind raced through the rules of engagement. A radar lock was an act of hostility. She was authorized to defend herself. But a missile in this storm, against a target this close, was a gamble with catastrophic consequences. A miss could be seen as an act of war. A hit could send debris raining down on the fleet. The static in her headset was a void, cutting her off from command, from guidance. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, heavier than the G-forces of any maneuver. She was the tip of the spear, and she was bending under the load. Then a memory flashed, not of the mockery or the name-calling, but of her father's study. The smell of old books and polish. He wasn't a general then, just her dad. He held a model plane, his hands gentle. "The sky does not care who you are, Eva," he had said, his voice quiet and firm. "It only respects skill. It only respects respect. A true pilot fights the plane and the situation before she ever fights the enemy. Anyone can pull a trigger. It takes a master to find another way." Another way. The words echoed in her mind, cutting through the fear. She looked at the drone, not as a pilot looking at a target, but as a student of aviation looking at a machine. It was programmed. It had parameters. It expected a certain response. It expected her to be predictable, to be scared. A new plan, audacious and terrifying, formed in her mind. It wasn't in the manual. It was pure, unadulterated instinct, honed by thousands of hours of flight time. She wouldn't fire. She would fly. She would speak to it in the only language a machine like this might understand, the language of undeniable presence. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with oxygen. Her voice was calm when she spoke, a message for the void, knowing no one could hear. "Watchtower Eagle-7. Link is down. Bogey is locked on. I am executing a non-standard intercept. Mark my position." She pushed the throttle forward. The engine's roar deepened, a promise of power. Instead of turning away, she edged closer to the drone, closing the gap with terrifying speed. The world outside narrowed to the shape of the drone and the raging storm. She could see the intricate details of its construction now, the seams in its metal skin. The whine of the radar lock was a constant scream in her ears, a sound she chose to ignore. She matched its speed, then its heading, until her wingtip was mere feet from its body. She was flying formation with the enemy. The drone held its position for a heartbeat, a silent and sinister companion in the raging theater of the storm. Then, with a sudden jerky movement that was utterly inhuman, it banked away. It was a small adjustment, a mere twitch, but to Eva's trained eye, it screamed of confusion. Its programming was scrambling. This close proximity, this blatant refusal to either fight or flee, was a variable its algorithms couldn't process. The relentless screech of the radar lock stuttered, then died completely. Silence flooded her helmet, a sound more shocking than the alarm. She had broken its lock not with countermeasures, but with sheer, unnerving audacity. But the victory was fleeting. The drone, now a few hundred feet away, stabilized. It didn't retreat. Instead, it began a slow, deliberate turn that chilled Eva more than any lock ever could. Its nose was no longer pointed at her. It was aligning itself on a new heading, cutting through the violent air with a single-minded purpose. She traced the imaginary line from its nose through the darkness and the slashing rain. It led directly to the heart of the carrier strike group, to the USS Vigilance. It was going for the ship. The cold focus that had possessed her now burned white-hot. This was no longer about proving a point or outsmarting a machine. This was about the 5,000 souls on that floating city below. She saw the faces of the deck crew who handed her coffee, the young mechanics who cared for her jet with proud diligence, her fellow pilots in the ready room, even Duke, with all his bluster. They were all down there, unaware that death was sketching a path through the storm directly toward them. There was no more time for cleverness, no more time for a better way. The ROE was clear. An imminent threat to the carrier was an imminent threat to the nation. The authorization to fire was inherent. The responsibility was hers, and hers alone. Her hands moved with a speed and precision that were pure muscle memory. A switch flicked under her thumb, arming the weapon system. A low, satisfying hum joined the engine's roar. On her heads-up display, a targeting reticle appeared, glowing a hostile red. She pushed the stick, bringing her nose in line with the drone. The reticle danced over its shape, the sophisticated sensors fighting the terrible weather, seeking a positive lock. "Come on," she whispered, a plea to her machine, to the gods of war, to herself. The drone was accelerating, pushing its own limits, a missile aimed at her home. Then a solid, piercing tone, a melody of death. The reticle turned green and flashed. The words "weapons track" illuminated the display. The drone was locked in her sights. There were no more choices, only action. Her index finger rested on the trigger, a slight pressure away from unleashing hell. She took one last breath, holding it. The world narrowed to the green light, the tone, and the dark shape of the enemy. She exhaled slowly, smoothly, and squeezed. A flash of fire and a streak of light erupted from beneath her wing, tearing into the darkness. The AM-9X Sidewinder missile raced ahead, a vengeful spirit ignoring the wind and rain. For a heart-stopping second, it seemed the storm would swallow it whole. Then a fireball blossomed in the night, a brief, violent sun that illuminated the swirling clouds and driving rain before being snuffed out by the tempest. There was no debris, no secondary explosion, just a silent, empty space where the threat had been. The silence in the cockpit was absolute. The screech of the lock was gone. The tone was gone. The only sound was the relentless howl of the storm and the heavy thump of her own heart against her ribs. It was over. She had done it. She had saved them. But the wave of relief was immediately crushed by a heavier weight. She had just fired a live weapon in a crowded international waterway. She had just destroyed a multi-million-dollar asset of a foreign power. The political fallout would be a hurricane all its own. And she had acted entirely on her own authority. The static in her headset crackled, then cleared. A voice, laced with the residual panic of the bridge, burst through. "Eagle-7, this is Vigilance Actual. Report status. We saw an explosion. What is your status?" Eva took a shuddering breath, forcing her voice back into its professional monotone. It was harder now. There was a tremor underneath. She hoped the microphone wouldn't pick up. "Vigilance Actual, Eagle-7. Threat is neutralized. I say again, bogey is destroyed. I am weapons safe, returning to base." The formal words felt alien. A script read after the play had already ended. There was a long pause on the other end. She could almost see the stunned faces on the bridge, the officers exchanging bewildered looks. The voice that came back was different. It was slower, deeper, filled with an awe that bordered on disbelief. It was the captain himself. "Copy that, Eagle-7. We confirm the bogey is gone." Another pause, this one heavier, more significant. "Eagle-7, that was outstanding work. Your discretion and judgment are noted." The words hung in the air. Asterisk discretion. Judgment. Asterisk, they were not words anyone had ever associated with Princess before. "Proceed to initial approach. The deck is waiting for you." The connection hissed softly. The storm still raged around her, but the battle was over. She had won. She guided her jet into a wide turn, pointing its nose toward the distant, unseen haven of the ship. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving a profound and aching exhaustion in its place. She had proven herself in the most brutal way possible. But as she flew through the darkness, the image of that fireball was seared onto her vision. The cost of her new respect felt immeasurable, and the quiet of the cockpit was suddenly filled with the ghosts of what she had been forced to do. The storm seemed to part for her, its fury spent. The return flight was a blur of instrument scans and automated checklists, her hands performing their duties by rote. The adrenaline that had been a fire in her veins was now a cold, heavy ash in her stomach. She had done her duty. She had protected her ship. So why did the cockpit, usually her sanctuary, feel like a cage of guilt? The ghost of the missile's trail was still imprinted on her eyes, a silent accusation in the dark. Then a pinprick of light in the abyss. Then another. and another. The USS Vigilance emerged from the gloom not as a ship, but as a constellation of hope laid out upon the Black Sea. Every light was on. The flight deck was a blazing runway of guidance lamps, a stark, beautiful contrast to the violent darkness she had just left. It was a welcome she had never seen before. Usually, a returning aircraft was just part of the machine. Tonight, the ship was lit up for her. The air boss's voice crackled in her ear, all business now, but with a new, unmistakable layer of respect. Eagle-7 called the ball. She could see the meatball, the lighted optical landing system, glowing steadily in the rain. It was centered. It was perfect. "I have the ball," she responded, her voice thankfully steady. The final approach was a dance she knew by heart. The reduced power, the gentle descent, the focus on keeping that glowing amber light centered. The deck grew larger, a vast, waiting platform. The violent storm still whipped the sea into a frenzy, but here, in this moment, there was only her and the deck. The jolt was brutal and glorious. A slam of deceleration that shoved her forward against her harness, as the arresting wire grabbed her jet and yanked it from the sky. From 150 knots to 0 in 2 seconds. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the pounding rain on the canopy and the whine of the engine spooling down. She was down. She was home. As she taxied out of a landing area, guided by the deck crew's wands, she saw them. They were everywhere. Sailors in rain-soaked jackets, pilots emerging from the island, all standing in the driving rain. They weren't running for cover. They were watching her. They were waiting for her. And then, a sound she couldn't quite believe. It started with a few, then spread across the entire deck, rising above the wind. They were cheering. They were slapping each other on the backs, pointing at her jet. Their faces split with grins she could see even through the rain-streaked canopy. A handler directed her to park. She went through the shutdown sequence, her fingers trembling now that the mission was truly over. As the canopy rose, the sound of the storm and the cheers flooded in, a roaring living thing. The ladder was slapped against the fuselage. She unstrapped, pulled off her helmet, and stood up in the cockpit, her hair instantly soaked by the cold rain. The first face she saw wasn't the handler's. It was Duke's. He stood there, rain plastering his hair to his forehead, his usual smirk gone. He looked at her, then at the empty sky from which she'd come, then back at her. He didn't say a word. He just nodded. It wasn't a nod of camaraderie or casual acknowledgement. It was a slow, deep, deliberate nod of respect, of awe. In that silent gesture, the call sign Princess didn't just become history. It was erased. The walk from her jet to the island was the longest and shortest of her life. The cheers were a wave she rode, a sound so foreign and overwhelming it felt like a dream. Sailors reached out not to mock, but to clap her on the shoulder. "Hell of a job, Lieutenant." "Way to fly, ma'am." The words washed over her, but they couldn't quite penetrate the shell of shock that encased her. Her body was on autopilot, moving through the rain and the noise toward the hatch. The moment the heavy steel door sealed behind her, the world went quiet. The roar of the storm and the celebration were muffled into a distant hum. The bright, sterile light of the passageway was a shock to her eyes. She stood there for a second, dripping onto the non-skid flooring, her flight suit clinging to her, the smell of jet fuel and rain filling her lungs. The adrenaline was gone, leaving a profound, bone-deep emptiness in its place. She had done it. She had saved the ship. So why did she feel so hollow? She became aware of a presence. Commander Briggs, the CAG, was standing a few feet away. He had been waiting for her. His face, usually a mask of stern command, was unreadable. He didn't smile. He didn't offer congratulations. He simply looked at her, his eyes taking in her pale, rain-streaked face, the slight tremble in her hands that she couldn't quite control. "Kozlov," he said, his voice low and even. "My office." Now, the walk to his office was a silent funeral procession. The celebration was outside. In here, the gravity of what had occurred was already settling like a lead weight. She followed him, her mind racing through every second of the engagement, searching for a mistake, for the flaw in her judgment that he had undoubtedly seen. He closed the door behind them. The office was small, dominated by a desk covered in paperwork and radar printouts. He didn't sit behind it. He stood in front of it, leaning against it, and crossed his arms. He studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment. The only sound was the drip of water from her suit onto the floor. "You broke protocol," he stated flatly. No anger, just a cold, hard fact. Eva's heart sank. This was it. The reckoning. "Sir, the radio link was down." "I had no." He held up a hand, cutting her off. "I'm not finished. You broke protocol. You engaged without explicit command authorization. You made a weapons-free decision entirely on your own initiative." He paused, letting the weight of that hang in the air between them. Then, the stern lines of his face softened, just a fraction. "And in doing so, Lieutenant Commander, you saved this ship and every soul on it. That drone was seconds from its attack run. Your actions were not just justified. They were exemplary." He pushed off the desk and stood straight. "The political mess is just beginning. There will be questions, inquiries, paperwork that will follow you for years. But that is my problem to handle." "Your problem," he said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips, "is that you've just made it impossible for me to ever let you transfer to another squadron." Dismissed. He turned to look at a radar screen, the conversation clearly over. Eva stood rooted to the spot, the whiplash of his words leaving her dizzy. It wasn't a court-martial. It was the highest praise she had ever received. She managed a quiet, "Thank you, sir," before turning to leave, the hollow feeling inside her finally beginning to fill with something warm, something solid. It was the first semblance of peace she had felt since the locked tone had screamed in her ears. The silence of her small stateroom was a physical presence. The metal door clicked shut, sealing her away from the echoes of celebration still reverberating through the ship's passageways. She leaned back against the cold steel, finally alone. The tremors started then, a fine, uncontrollable shaking that began in her hands and traveled up her arms. She hugged herself tightly, but it was no use. The image of the fireball blooming in the storm played on a relentless loop behind her eyes. The screech of the missile, the silent void after the explosion, it was all there, burned into her memory. She had pulled the trigger. She had ended something. The weight of that action settled on her chest, making it hard to breathe. A soft knock on the door made her jump. She wiped a hand quickly across her eyes, composing herself. "It's open." The door swung open to reveal not Commander Briggs or a fellow officer, but Chief Warrant Officer Miller, a grizzled old deck handler whose face was a road map of 30 years at sea. He didn't say a word. In his hands were 2 steaming mugs. He held one out to her. The rich, familiar scent of strong black coffee, the lifeblood of the Navy, filled the small room. She took it, her hands wrapping around the warmth, the ceramic feeling solid and real. "Thanks, Chief," he grunted, taking a sip from his own mug. He looked around the sparse room, his eyes missing nothing. "Rough night," he stated, his voice a low rumble. Eva could only nod, the word stuck in her throat. She looked down into the dark liquid, seeing her own fractured reflection. "Lost my first bird to a SAM over the Gulf in '91, he said casually, as if commenting on the weather. "Good pilot. Good man." Watched him eject. Watched his chute open. Then watched a sand dune swallow him up. Never found him. He took another long sip. "You did what you had to do, Lieutenant. You made the call. The right call. The only call. This thing you're feeling? It ain't doubt. It's the price of the ticket. It's what it costs to sit in that chair and be the one who decides. Everyone out there," he jerked his thumb toward the door, "they get to cheer because you pay that price tonight. Don't you ever regret keeping them safe." He finished his coffee in one final gulp and placed the empty mug on her desk with a definitive clink. The coffee's terrible, but it's hot. Get some sleep, Eagle-7. You've earned it. He left as quietly as he came, closing the door behind him. Eva was alone again, but the silence was different now. The chief's words hadn't erased the memory, but they had framed it. He had given a name to the hollow feeling, the price of the ticket. It wasn't a punishment, it was a burden. One that she had chosen to carry the day she earned her wings. She took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter and scalding and perfect. The shaking in her hands had finally stopped. She looked at the empty chair in her room, and for the first time, she didn't see the ghost of the pilot they had mocked. She saw the commander who had made the hard choice. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would make the exact same call again. A week later, the storm was a memory, replaced by a sun so bright it turned the flight deck into a shimmering mirage. The air was crisp, clean, carrying the familiar smells of salt and jet fuel. The entire crew, it seemed, was assembled on the deck in crisp white uniforms, forming neat rows before a temporary podium. The mood was solemn, proud. The American flag snapped smartly in the steady breeze. Eva stood at attention, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She wore her service dress blues, every crease sharp, every medal perfectly aligned. The CAG stood at the microphone, his voice amplified across the deck, detailing the events of that night with a clinical precision that belied the chaos she remembered. Facing an imminent and direct threat to the ship, with communications severed and no time for consultation, Lieutenant Commander Kozlov exercised flawless judgment and unparalleled skill. Her actions were in strict accordance with the rules of engagement and were directly responsible for the preservation of this vessel and its crew. He turned to her, holding a small, velvet box. Inside, on a bed of blue, was the Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal. It was not for valor in combat, but for meritorious achievement. It was perfect. It recognized her judgment, her professionalism, the very things they had mocked. For your exceptional professionalism and decisive action under extreme duress, the CAG said, his voice echoing across the silent deck. He pinned the medal to her chest. The medal was cool against her uniform. He then took a step back and rendered a sharp, crisp salute. The entire crew, 5,000 strong, followed suit as one. The sound of 5,000 hands snapping to 5,000 brows was a single, thunderous crack of respect that rolled across the flight deck. It was a sound more powerful than any storm. Eva returned the salute, her own movement automatic, her vision blurring slightly as she held the pose. The ceremony ended. The ranks broke, and the crew began to disperse back to their duties. Eva remained standing there, letting the sun warm her face. Duke approached her, his usual swagger replaced by a quiet humility. He didn't offer a joke or a casual remark. He simply extended his hand. Eagle-7, he said, and the name sounded right. It sounded true. I owe you a drink. Several, actually. She shook his hand, a genuine smile finally breaking through her formal composure. I'll hold you to that, Duke. She walked slowly toward the bow of the great ship, away from the crowd. She needed a moment alone. Leaning against the safety rail, she looked out at the endless blue expanse. The ocean was calm now, peaceful, showing no trace of the fury it had held. She touched the medal on her chest, not with pride, but with a sense of quiet acceptance. The ghost of the fireball was still there, but it was no longer a specter of guilt. It was a part of her now, a part of the price she had paid for the right to stand here. She wasn't the general's daughter. She wasn't princess. She was Eva Kozlov, a pilot who had been tested and had not been found wanting. The sky ahead was clear and endless, and for the first time, she felt she truly belonged in it.